We're taking a look at topics related to the third talk we gave, the third lesson we gave about the image of God on the vocational view. So, in this discussion, we're going to be talking about this plural that reference to God that comes up in Genesis 1, verse 26. We've just been reading it every lesson so far, but not mentioning it. It's like, it's fine, ignore it. But now we're going to talk about it and talk about what it could mean. So, to be more specific, what I'm talking about here is in Genesis 1, verse 26, it says the following. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," which is kind of a weird thing for him to say, because there's only been one God in the picture up until this point. And then when he goes and does it, what makes it a bit more puzzling is when he actually goes and does it in verse 27, God is doing it by himself. So the question is, who is this us or this our that is being referred to in Genesis 1, verse 26? So Matt, I'm pretty sure I believe this when I first read it as a Christian, and I'm pretty sure most Christians would jump to the explanation that this is referring to the Trinity, that God is referring to it's God the Father referring to God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. Uh, what do we make of a suggestion like that?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely the view that I've heard most. And actually, I remember quite clearly um, I was sitting through a sermon series on Genesis, and after the sermon, the preacher ended up getting a mouthful from somebody in the congregation for not saying that the us was the Trinity. And I mean, I don't even know what the preacher thought about it, whether whether he thought it was the Trinity, whether he just, didn't know.
Oh, he just didn't say anything?
But he just didn't mention it in the sermon. Just
Oh,
didn't
wow.
think it important enough to talk about. And I mean, kind of like we've done so far in our lessons.
Yeah.
Like there were other
Yeah.
things that just were more important for him at the time, but he ended up getting a mouthful because this person was very convinced. No, this is the Trinity. Um, it it's a little bit, on one level, it's an appealing view. As the Bible story goes on, we do get some idea that there's some plurality in God, and what we see is certainly in the New Testament is that God is triune, Father, Son, Spirit. It's what we believe as Christians, and if it's what we believe about God in a timeless way, if this is always who God was and always what God has been like, then we would expect it to find it in Genesis. The problem is Genesis was written a long time before the New Testament. It was written a long time before they had any inkling that God was actually going to step into the world as God the Son. And although there's mention of God the Spirit, I think especially as time went on, the Israelites really doubled down on the unity of God and this idea of monotheism. You get this very strongly in Second Isaiah, where the writer actually has a proper go at anybody who fashions idols, because there's one God, and that's Yahweh. It seems very odd then that they would have this idea of Trinity. I think the word I'd use is anachronistic. It's something that would only really get fleshed out in their thinking later, and only be developed later. So kind of import it into these earlier chapters, I think, is probably not what's going on.
I guess we got to recognize that even though obviously God knew that he was triune, and he was triune at this time, he has always been triune, as you say. The Bible is still written through like humans, and so he kind of works with what people know at that time or in that given circumstance. And the author of Genesis just wouldn't have had the categories to make sense of or to be saying that God is triune before Jesus gets on the scene and forces us to have to rethink how God is.
Yeah. I mean, at best, we've got a duality, because you've got the dimension of the Spirit in the beginning. But even that, I'm not terribly persuaded by.
Yeah, because even in the way that it's discussed, like the Spirit is on earth and God is in heaven, sort of thing, and it's sort of it's tricky.
I think the thing that the other reason, so the one being that, well, this is what God is like, so we'd expect it to be in Genesis. The other reason is that, well, what else could it be? So maybe we could talk about that. What other options do we have? If the we isn't the Trinity, then who?
Yeah, so it turns out there's actually quite a few different options, but I think the one that you and I most gravitate towards as like an alternative that fits within the mindset of what we would take the author of Genesis to have, as well as with language elsewhere in the Old Testament, would be that the Hebrew idea of a divine courtroom or heavenly courtroom. So, or I guess a more modern phrase would be like a heavenly parliament or something like that, right? Where God is
Sure.
sort of the head of the parliament, he's the chairman, and then there are these other spiritual beings in the courtroom, and they are sort of his not his counselors. What are they called? The ministers of of his courtroom. Uh, and in this case, then what would be happening is he, as the chairman, is saying, "Let's go do this. You know, let's make an official decree, or let's do something officially in our capacity." And then it's really interesting actually because in verse 27, then the fact that he does it by himself shows there's like an asymmetry, an important asymmetry. Like God can do this by himself. He doesn't need, or does this by himself. He doesn't need the other members of the courtroom to do it with him or something like that.
He isn't dependent on them. Although
He isn't dependent. That's the word, yeah.
although he has a staff team, it's not like he has them because he needs them. He has them because he wants them, and they're kind of this further opportunity to bring him glory. I mean, he didn't need to make humans either, and he did.
Yeah, exactly. Or yeah, or even yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned humans because it's exactly the same thing. He didn't need to make humans, but he also he didn't need to make us in his image, right? He didn't have to get us to help him rule creation.
Yeah,
It was like out of his abundance of like I don't know generosity that he gives us the opportunity to share in his rule over creation, and the
yeah.
same would then be true of this parliament. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, just to give some other examples of where this comes up. Maybe you can think of some, Matt. So I know a really obvious example comes in the beginning of Job,
Mm,
um,
yeah,
where God is he's sort of saying, "Have you guys seen my servant Job? He's really great. Like he's doing a great job." And then you hear about one who came through the like almost you can imagine him like pushing through the crowd to like make an objection to God. Like I don't think it's really that, but who's he talking to, right? He's talking to this divine courtroom of his these fellow or the heavenly court. Yeah.
yeah. There's also another example in Kings of the council discussing how they're going to trip up one of the kings. I forget who it is now. I don't remember the top of my head. I think it might have been Ahab, but don't quote me on that. I might have that wrong. Either way, it's this discussion about how they're gonna, what are they gonna do with him? And in the end, one of them comes up with an idea, and God's like, "Cool, yeah, do that."
That's I don't know about that one. That's cool. I like that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's got its own difficulties. I mean,
sure.
that is also a bit of a minefield passage, but so we're not going to go into that right now. But it does seem to be an instance of the divine counsel at work.
It's probably also what's being referenced in Psalm 8 when he says, "What is man that you are mindful of, and the Son of Man that you care for him? You've created him just a little lower than the heavenly beings."
Yeah,
So he probably has
heavenly
something like that
beings.
in mind as well.
That um that verse is loaded.
No?
It's got all
Oh,
sorts
okay.
of no. I mean, heavenly beings is fine. I think it's actually a pretty good translation, but there are a whole lot of textual issues with that where um the Hebrew has Elohim, which is typically the word we'd use for God. That's what we find in Genesis 1. Vayomer Elohim, and God said, what. But in other cases, it can just refer more generically to spiritual beings. The Bible Project actually has a very interesting podcast series on this and a very interesting series of videos on this. So that gives one take on how we might think about that. But that's what we have in Psalm 8 in the Hebrew. In some other versions, though, in the Greek, I think it's the Greek. I forget where exactly, but there were some that were kind of like a little bit uncomfortable with this, so they changed it. Instead of using what we'd expect the Greek equivalent to be, theos, they used angelos, angels.
Oh, okay.
So there's kind of this, in some translations you'll see, in fact, let me just pull one up quick. In some translations, so the ESV has heavenly beings. The NIV has the angels.
Okay, interesting.
Although it does have a footnote to say or little lower than God, or the gods, the Elohim, the spiritual beings, which I think to me makes the most sense. It seems like um, that's what's going on there to me.
I
But
remember
yeah,
when
that's
the
quite loaded.
Bible Project stuff came out, it was very interesting, and it got me thinking about what we associate with this idea, this word God or Elohim. And to me, there seem to be like we have these two different ideas, or three, let's say. So we think of, in our context, we think of God as the creator, and then we think of God as the ruler, right? And then we can also think of God as the judge. And the sometimes the word Elohim, just as the word God can be used for all of those, so the word Elohim can be used for all of them. But when we're talking about, and I guess this helps us to distinguish between different parts of the divine or the heavenly court. So the heavenly court is ruling with God, right? So ruling with the supreme God, the chairman. But they don't create and they don't judge, and we see that in Genesis. So when they create man, it's just God creating man, even though he says, let us do this. So it's like, made an official decree, and then he goes and does it himself. And then later, again, we see this plural in Genesis 11 with the judgment of at Babel. And he says, let us go down and confuse them and all that stuff. And then God goes down and confuses them and all that stuff. And so again, we see him being primary in that sense. So they all rule. He rules with the parliament, but he's the primary ruler. And then his primacy is also indicated by him being the only one who creates and the only one who judges.